Our next service is a handler. As you probably remember, the handler is responsible for validating the messages, parsing them, and storing them in the system's data store. One of the major factors that will influence the handler's design is the fact that the messages to be handled are waiting in a queue after being placed there by the receiver. This fact dictates the type of application of the handler service. Remember how we selected the type of the logging service? Well, the handler service is quite similar. In the logging service, the log records were pulled from a queue by the service and then stored in a data store. The handler service works the same. It pulls the messages from a queue, handles them, and stores them in a data store. In the logging service, this fact caused us to decide it's going to be a Windows service, because there is no request-response execution model here, but a service that is always on and pulls the queue. And the same goes for the handler service. It is not a request-response service. It's always active and is busy pulling the queue. So the handler service is going to be a Windows service too. Good. Next, the technology stack. By now, we already have two services for which we determined the technology stack, the logging service and the receiver. In both, we went for .NET Core. Since it looks like there is no real reason to select other technology for the handler service, since there are no special requirements, and it will be developed by the same teams who developed the other services, we can be quite comfortable in using .NET Core here too. Okay, good. And now to the architecture. We are going to use the traditional layered architecture pattern here, same as in other services. Let's examine what layers are relevant here. First, service interface. Well, we don't have one. This service does not expose any API. It is always active and initiates the call to the queue. It's not waiting for requests from other services. So this layer, instead of exposing API, will orchestrate the work against the queue. Specifically, this layer is responsible for timing the polling of the queue and executing the actual polling. Let's call this layer polling, same as in the logging service. Good. Next layer is the business logic layer, and yes, the handler service definitely needs such a layer. This layer is responsible for validating and parsing the messages, which are typical jobs for business logic layer. Now, note that in a real-world app, we would have discussed a plugin mechanism to allow dynamic loading of validators and parsers for specific message types, and this is definitely the recommended approach here. But for the sake of simplicity, I'll leave that out for now and assume that the validation and parsing are coded right into the business logic. And last but not least, the data access layer. This is an extremely important layer in this service, and it's responsible for saving the handled messages into the data store. This is very relevant here, and we will leave it as part of our layered architecture. And of course, let's add the logging engine, which, similar to the one we used in the receiver, is vertical and accessible by all the layers. Great, so now we have the architecture for the handler service. Let's move on to the next service.